Hello, and welcome to the National Spectrum Consortium Spotlight Series. I'm Sal D'Itri, the chairman of the consortium. The Spotlight Series is a group of 5-minute interviews we're doing with NSC members. Now, let me introduce Gary Coffey. He's Senior Spectrum Manager at Northrop Grumman. And today our theme is spectrum management. Gary, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Sal.
Before we dive into today's topic of spectrum management, something that's near and dear to the National Spectrum Consortium, and really something that's in the national spotlight, I'd say more now than ever, take a few minutes and tell us about your day job at Northrop Grumman.
Well, over the 19 plus years I've been with Northrop Grumman, I've done a lot of various, spectrum management realms. Lately, I'm more involved in the RF engineering aspect of it. We're doing an antenna modeling, doing some co-site analysis. I'm working various capture and proposal efforts. And a lot of that leads to, RF production. So I'm involved in a lot of the RADAS studies. So the Hero, Herp, and HERF studies, along with the RF engineering. So that's mainly what I'm really involved in today.
You bring up a couple good points. Today is spectrum, again, as I've said, it's in the news. It's critical as we're looking at DoD's growth, we're looking at consumer and enterprise commercial application growth. A lot of this can get down to spectrum supportability studies, something a lot of people don't know much about unless you're in the spectrum community. What do you see as some of the most compelling use cases? And maybe take a minute and tell our listeners what exactly is a spectrum supportability study.
Well, I think there's actually quite a few little, case studies out there. The Joint Services put a good guidebook out for the SSRA, the Spectrum Supportability Risk Assessment out there. So they actually walk through the whole, what is the overall goal of it? Who are the actors involved? So they actually walk through the regulatory, the technical, the operational aspect of it. If you're doing a complete SSRA, that goes through the whole, milestone life cycle of the program. But what a lot of industry, the large corporations, the Lockheeds, the Northrop, the GDs, typically they don't get involved to that detail on there. One of the good things I do like about that document is there's a real good Venn diagram in the back. So it actually shows where's that overlap between E3, electromagnetic environmental effects, to spectrum supportability. So that overlap is actually what the SSRA document, produces. So a lot of the industry, they'll key on just say one aspect of it. I just look at the spectrum supportability, or they'll look at the E3 aspect, but they don't really look at the complete, picture of everything. That's where the coordination with the program management office is critical on that, because they're the ones that have the direct communications with the spectrum management office.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about how all of this is intertwined today, that the spectrum environment is more complex today than it ever has been because of the use of things like intelligence gathering sensors, advanced communications, electronic warfare. Would you agree with that?
Oh, exactly. I mean, the whole EW aspect of it just brings it, entwined even more. In the past, they were separate elements altogether. Spectrum management didn't deal with the electronic warfare. Now they're actually embedded in the same fire cell. So they have to know what each other's doing, and you also bring in the intel piece of that as well.
So in looking at spectrum supportability and dealing with that, what are some issues that come to mind for you in particular bands? Why has it happened, and how can we perhaps start working on solutions to get through these things?
From personal experience, I think probably the two things that I've seen the most of and encompassing is the lack of overall knowledge of other existing spectrum-dependent systems within that area. Say a vendor's going to produce a box, and he comes in there and says, okay, I've done my interference analysis, we should be good to go on this and that, but they don't really know all the other systems that are in that area. And the other big area that I see a lot of times with kickback is host nation. A lot of times they'll look at, okay, I've done all my EMI studies, we are good to go within CONUS. The minute I go CONUS to another country, the dynamics change, and a lot of times the people didn't do the due diligence to work with that COCOM that deals with those countries in particular to make sure there's not going to be any issues. So I think having the complete picture and then coordinating with the host nation is real important.
Yeah, well said, and I agree 100%. When given that background, where do you see the services with their different needs going in terms of spectrum management?
In short term, near term, I don't really see the services, getting away from, the legacy system they're using right now, Spectrum 21. But with the 5G infrastructure starting to show themselves on some of the bases out there. Miramar stood up one. They're using Verizon's infrastructure, and the edge computing is going to be there. So I think that you're going to start seeing a lot of the spectrum management community start looking at some of the edge computing. One of the dynamics with the 5G is when they roll onto a military installation, be it Marine Corps, Army, Navy, they deal really with the installation spectrum manager, not the tenant spectrum managers. So I think the tenant spectrum managers really need to be involved with that installation spectrum manager. Because as 5G moves forward, it's not just going to stay at the installation. When units start deploying, they're going to deploy Internet of Things devices and everything else with them. So they have to have that full understanding of capability and potential issues, that 5G brings.
Yeah, my follow-on question would have been, so if we look out like over the next 10 years, where do you envision spectrum management going? And I really like what you just said, because it's also a question of where do we see the spectrum manager going, and what kind of skill set does a spectrum manager need 10 years from now? Is he the same animal that he is today, or is he part cloud, part RF, part comms, maybe part multi-domain? It's a really interesting vision. Tell us a bit about what you think 10 years from now, what spectrum management will look like.
Well, real quick, if I go back 20 years back with the Joint Tactical Radio System that was going to put all the spectrum managers out of business, they're still here, but we can talk about that system. I think it's going to evolve. Spectrum management will still be around. Where I see spectrum management in the future, this is my personal opinion, but I believe you're going to see a policy-based dynamic spectrum access. I mean, right now, the spectrum managers, the days of managing a single frequency they're going to be gone. But the spectrum managers they build their load sets or have quick. So they build those sets. I see in the future, same thing, but maybe they'll be building a policy. They'll be building a policy for that DSA system that through machine learning and AI can alleviate some of the load that the spectrum manager does. But I think they'll still be involved in generating and building those policies.
Yeah, and I really like how you paint a vision of career growth and knowledge growth for the spectrum manager. As you mentioned, sometimes folks will say, well, this means something to my career or to my job, but really and this isn't really an opportunity, I think is what you're painting, and I really like that.
Oh, exactly.
Well, look, Gary, that's all the time we have for today. These things go by too quickly. I'd like to thank Gary Coffey from Northrop Grumman for spending time with us and talking about spectrum management. If you want to learn more about the topic, feel free to reach out to Gary or myself through the National Spectrum Consortium. This is Sal D'Itri for the NSC Spotlight Series. Thanks again, everyone.